Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to get some refreshment and are ready for our next session. This session is on the faculty experience, and as Lorna noted this morning, there are many constituents in higher education, and we've heard a wonderful panel on the student experience, which emphasized, I would say, the importance of belonging. And in my own longitudinal data, belonging in the early 20s predicts contentment at age 30, even if you consider financial stability and other factors. And so I'm very excited about this next session of what we call lightning talks on the faculty experience. These lightning talks are short talks, one after the other, kind of TED Talk style, and they will focus, of course, on the faculty experience and gender in higher education. So I am going to introduce all 4 speakers at once, and then they will come up one at a time and give their lightning talk, and that will be the session. So the first person who will come up is Mary Blair-Loy, who is a professor of sociology at the University of California, San Diego. She will be followed by Jessie Brown, Executive Vice President of the American Council on Education, who will be followed by Alicia Sasser Modestino, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and Economics at Northeastern University, and finally by Leroy Gonsalves, Assistant Professor of Management and Organizations in the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. So it is now my pleasure to invite Mary Blair-Loy to the podium. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all the organizers of this wonderful conference. This brief talk will be acknowledging my co-authors. I'll acknowledge them all right now to save time. Erin Seck, Pamela Cosman, Jordan Packer, Stephen Reinders, and my funder, the National Science Foundation. So in higher education, we often see a paradox. Academia venerates meritocracy. The university is seen as a sacred space, buffered from the influence of politics. STEM faculty, which I study, consider themselves to be, in this one quote, being analytical and data-driven. We will look at the CVs and pick the best candidate, regardless of ethnicity or gender. And most agree that the tenure process is fair and reasonable. Yet at the same time, some sociodemographic groups are underrepresented, and they are often devalued. So based on rigorous analyses, my co-authors and I find that inequities are not only, and perhaps not even primarily viewed due to individual biases, bad biases seeping in from outside the hallowed halls of academia, but they are also, and perhaps fundamentally due to revered features within academic STEM culture. And I call these revered features cultural yardsticks of merit, which are often warped. So we'll briefly consider how can we unwarp these cultural yardsticks in our own organizations. In my data, there is similar productivity across sociodemographic groups, yet women, mothers, minoritized men, and LGBTQ faculty fare worse than white and Asian heterosexual men on average in terms of a variety of characteristics: respect, integration, and for mothers, salary. So what are these schemas of merit? They are cherished beliefs about who deserves respect. They're historically rooted, often very deep roots, and they provide taken-for-granted frameworks for understanding reality. They provide cognitive maps as well as emotional and moral frameworks. The first one I'll briefly tell you about is the work devotion schema. And this is an understanding of our work as a calling or vocation. And it connects our profession to our personhood and gives us a sense of purpose. A couple of citations from STEM academics. I get great pleasure in cutting through a problem and seeing the light. If I were independently wealthy, I'd pay to have this job, discovering that no one on the planet knew before. And I enjoy this process of discovery. I enjoy interacting with students. It makes me feel like I'm doing something good with my life. And these data are consistent with neurologists' arguments that from birth onward, social bonds help our brains develop and think in concert with other brains. Wheatley says, and as much as spiders use their webs to think, the social webs in which we are embedded shape and are shaped by our mental models and experiences. So personally, I love my work. I take it to go with a large coffee. I'll work from the bleachers. I'll work watching interminable baseball series, and unfortunately, my son's high school team won the local finalists, so I had to travel. I once wrote an entire paper squinting backstage during my son's, frankly, interminable rehearsals and performances with the San Diego Opera. I got to support him, get some work done, and hear lots of Puccini. So what's not to love about work devotion? One thing that concerns us is that on average in our data, mothers' productivity in academia is similar to non-mothers, i.e. Men and women without children. Yet motherhood is viewed as violating work devotion. That new mothers have problems just thinking about science. Yet these concerns are not voiced about men colleagues being distracted by a new startup, for example, or a consulting gig. And research by Jabot and Taylor shows that this work devotion mandate can steer talented women in graduate STEM programs out of academia altogether and into what they hope are the welcoming arms of industry. Another cultural yardstick is the schema of professional excellence. And this is an expectation that excellence is witnessed by individualism, being self-promoting, having individual brilliance, being competitive, and men are more likely to be viewed in these terms, especially white and Asian, particularly white heterosexual men. Assertive STEM faculty do in fact receive higher income in our data. They are rewarded for their individual brilliance, yet they are actually not more productive on average. So what can we do in our own workplaces to reconceive merit? Let's take a quick look at new research I've done with my colleagues on how finalist candidates are treated. As many of you know, academic jobs are very competitive, and a job offer might receive multiple candidates, perhaps hundreds, that are gradually whittled down, and then a short number of finalists are invited to campus for a 2-day visit. This is intense. You meet everybody, you try to demonstrate your brilliance. And the most important part is when the candidate steps up to the podium to present original research that they've done, and this is called colloquially the job talk. So my colleagues and I analyzed video recordings of about 200 job talks in 4 engineering departments over 6 years. First, we used qualitative methods to analyze the introductions of the candidates. When a senior faculty member, usually from the search committee, first introduces the speaker. So recall that this is a two-way courting process. The department is analyzing and evaluating the speaker, but the speaker may get more than one job offer. And so they're seeing if this department might be a good fit for them. And remarkably, we find that the introductions of candidates tend to magnify the research competence of men and diminish it for women. Again, this is the short list. These are all highly, highly excellent scholars. The introductions were 2 to 3 times more likely to overlook women's research awards listed right there on their CVs compared to men. And they were more likely to give positive introductions for men, especially among the longest quartile of introductions. These lengthy introductions often studded their introductions of men candidates with accolades, while those of women often rambled on with irrelevant and sometimes embarrassing remarks. A couple of quick examples. An introduction of a man candidate, notably for someone who is still a PhD student, James here has 4 Best Paper Awards. His work already has an H index, a productivity index, this very large number. So if you'll excuse me, I'll need to go start doing some research. But these are just numbers. What I think is really exciting is his wonderful, infectious curiosity. He has great research ideas, and you'll see lots of examples in this talk. And then contrast with these 2 introductions of women candidates. And because Khalida has already worked with several people here, it's been challenging filling her schedule. Because people are like, I know her, I don't need another meeting. Esther is a subfield engineer, almost through and through, except for 1 year of flirting as a freshman with a different field, right? Before becoming a PhD student, she earned her undergraduate degree in this different subfield, and boy, was she a busy undergraduate student. She just couldn't sit still. So let me tell you a little bit about her internships. So the contrast is striking. We also analyzed the number and type of questions speakers received during the talk itself. So not the Q&A following the talk, but during the talk. And our findings are on academic STEM, but they're consistent with research that Alicia, who will be speaking a bit later, and her colleagues have done in the field of economics. So there are a large number of questions within a 40 to 50-minute talk, again, prior to the formal Q&A session. Some questions were neutral, calmly seeking extra information perhaps, or constructive, or curious. Some were overlapping the speaker's speech and therefore introducing the speaker as they were trying to make a point. And other questions were confrontational, and some I would characterize as rude. Now, during this research, which we did the video recording between 2014 and 2019, the engineering division also launched a new training of faculty search committees, where they used my research and many other scholars to talk about implicit bias and departmental culture and how we can better be welcoming and inclusive of all our excellent faculty and candidates. And then this shows the variation in the percent of faculty trained, 0 in 2014, 1 department began training in 2015, and by 2019, the percent of faculty department trained ranges from about 5% up to about 45%. So there's variation in training. And there's a lot I could say about this research, but instead I want to really focus on what we can do about it about these issues of warped yardsticks. So among the job talks in departments that had zero training during this period, these are the predicted number of questions that candidates received. There were about double the number of confrontational questions and overlapping questions asked of Black or Latinx presenters compared to white or Asian presenters, and a significantly larger number of total questions asked of Black or Latinx scholars. The mean was about 26 questions, and that is a lot to field during a 40 to 50-minute talk when you're trying to make a point, build a research arc, and bring your talk to its compelling conclusion. However, the training actually reduced the numbers of total overlapping and confrontational questions. So the numbers of overlapping questions went down significantly, the numbers of total questions went down, and then the graph on the right is enlarged version of confrontational, because those are potentially the most corrosive, undermining the excellence of the scholar. And those went down from about 0.7 in the departments with no training to almost 0 for the departments with 40% of faculty trained. So we might ask a question, why did this training work? Some other research has shown that training isn't effective. And in our case, the training was done by a respected member of the engineering division, a senior faculty member with a strong academic record. It wasn't done by a consultant from outside, an HR professional, or a vulnerable assistant professor. And the training emphasized this active, continuous learning that we do as academics, and that we're trying to up our skill set and better understand. And so the training was seen as consistent with the schemas of devotion and excellence, not trying to bring in some kind of suspicious other expectation about diversity being valued. So we can indeed reconceive merit. And this is better for our workplaces and our schools. The work devotion schema creates exhaustion, and exhaustion undermines creative thinking. And these trainings, as I've described, can lean into our wired to connect humanity with our colleagues in the department and emphasize returning to core values of the discipline, not bringing in suspect other views about diversity. No, we're here returning to core values. The trainings emphasize the importance of collegial collaboration over individualistic self-promotion, and all the research that shows that demographically and disciplinary diverse teams are often more innovative. And we can also here, all of us in this room, can continue to reconceive ourselves. We produce more innovative work when we're rested and have a life outside of work. It is better for our research, our students, our families, and ourselves when we dismantle those warped yardsticks of merit. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jessie Brown.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for this conference and for inviting me here today. I feel like a little bit of an imposter on this panel because it's about the faculty experience and I'm not a faculty member. You can tell because I'm not even going to use any slides. I'm a lawyer by training, though, and I've spent a lot of my career thinking about access and equity in higher ed, anti-discrimination laws, and especially about sexual harassment in higher ed. And so I'm going to focus my short remarks here on that phenomenon and how we can think about eradicating it. I have experience in this area from working at the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, where we enforced the laws, at the National Association of College and University Attorneys, where I worked with lawyers standing up institutional response, and now I have sort of a bird's eye view at the American Council on Education regarding institutional practices. I also serve on the leadership committee of the National Academy's Action Collaborative on Preventing Sexual Harassment in Higher Ed, where they really work to lift up promising practices that are informed by evidence, that are evidence-based in preventing and reducing sexual harassment. So I'm sure that many of you appreciate that this is not a problem on the margins. The survey data shows that it is, survey data show that it's a pervasive problem. A study by the National Academies in 2018 showed that 50% of female academics report some form of sexual harassment at some point in their academic career. And so it's a big problem, and it merits careful attention. So my point, especially coming to you as a person trained as a lawyer, is a little bit unexpected, and which is that I don't think that the legal system is really the solution to this problem. It's one tool, to be sure, but this is a problem rooted in culture, and so it requires culture change. So as Dean Brown-Nagin mentioned at the beginning, we have two federal laws in this area that are most relevant. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 that prohibits discrimination, sex discrimination in education programs, and then Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of sex, among other characteristics. And partly as a response to Title IX, institutions have built quite robust compliance structures. We have Title IX coordinators everywhere. We have reporting mechanisms, very, very robust grievance procedures, mandatory trainings. And so colleges and universities are pretty good at setting up these structures, but they're really reactive by design. They're responding to harassment that's happened and been reported. And even still, the legal framework doesn't always map onto people's lived experiences. The National Academies actually has this wonderful visual, which I think of a lot in the context of sexual harassment, which is an iceberg. And the very top of the iceberg, the little piece that's above the waterline, is the sort of most egregious harassment: coercion, sexual assault, unwanted advances. Sort of this is the stuff that the law most readily reaches. And then below the waterline, and especially way below the waterline, is the vast bulk of, I think, what we're seeing that people really actually experience. Hostile comments, exclusion, these questions and job talks, as Professor Blair-Loy just mentioned, being talked over, having your work diminished, all these sort of series of small indignities. And so a lot of people don't even know if what they're experiencing would rise to the level of being recognized by the law, so they might not come forward. I actually do think this is changing a bit, because I think that there's a generation of students that are then graduate students and then becoming faculty members that do view these sort of deep below the waterline experiences as harassment that, taken in aggregate, can create a hostile environment. But we do have structural hierarchies that stand in the way. So the legal process doesn't work on prevention, really. On top of that, the legal standards can't address all forms of harassment that are experienced by faculty on campus. So we do have a structural challenge, and particularly so where some of our norms in academia throw up roadblocks. I want to be really clear that I'm speaking in generalizations, and there's lots of institutions that have done a lot to make progress in these areas. But a few of the common culprits might be, I think of the academic star culture, where you have really high-profile faculty that sort of operate outside of the normal rules because they're so elite, and more junior people sort of know that implicitly. Other myriad examples of the power differentials in academia: the advisor-advisee relationship, the tenure hierarchy, the lab principal-investigator dynamic. And if those with less power aren't really sure that their concerns are going to be taken seriously, they don't want to even risk ruining their professional aspirations by coming forward. And then faculty discipline is often handled at the department level, and so it's not like other administrative staff handled in a centralized way, and therefore the efforts may not be as coordinated. And then another potential structural challenge is that often department chairs, who'll be responsible for a lot of these administrative duties, are rotated on fixed terms of tenured faculty. So the chair might not necessarily have a huge incentive to make headway on a cultural challenge, even if they observe one, because it's a temporary service duty. It's not really their primary professional focus. In prepping for this panel, I actually went back and read a bunch of Office for Civil Rights resolution agreements with universities over the last few years. And a couple of themes, I think, emerged, practices that are concerning in this space. One is this off-the-books system for faculty discipline in many areas, where the process is complex and it's slow and it's handled internally by deans. And then the second issue is the practice of closing an active investigation if the faculty member leaves and goes to a different institution. It sends a terrible signal to the complainant that the institution doesn't really want to recognize the harm or prevent it at the next institution. And then one final piece that I think is a little bit unique to the faculty is faculty governance. Faculty don't always see themselves as employees of the institution the way that administrators or other staff do. And so top-down compliance doesn't tend to work as well. We have a tradition of shared governance, and so I would posit that I think what works much better is when faculty themselves are taking on the responsibility as a genuine commitment to their junior colleagues and to graduate students and to other staff in their department. The American Association of University Professors, in their Principles of Shared Governance, have a framework for collegial accountability, and that's where I think the promise for culture change really lies. And frankly, as lawyers, we have to be comfortable with the fact that maybe the most powerful solutions aren't going to operate within the legal framework. So some promising practices along these lines. One, climate surveys. 15 years ago, they were sort of the exception, and now they're increasingly standard practice. They're able to measure people's opinions, people's feelings on trust and culture, and whether they feel like they're going to be believed if they come forward. There's bystander intervention programs, some of them backed up by randomized controlled trials, including, for example, Cornell's intervention program. It's a 20-minute video and then a 60-minute workshop that actually did measurably increase a bystander's willingness to intervene. And I would argue that this is a prevention technique as much as it is a culture signal that it's bystanders' responsibility to do and say something. Vanderbilt's Medical Center has a cup of coffee practice that's been very successful and been replicated at other academic medical centers. And this is where a trusted peer or department chair will have an extremely early conversation with a colleague when concerning behavior comes to their attention before it rises to a policy violation. And they're sort of relying on that collegial relationship instead of an administrative authority or a formal complaint process. There's restorative justice approaches in this area that focus, everyone has to agree to it, but to agree to do the process, but they focus on acknowledging the harm and taking accountability and then healing rather than a punishment. So they empower the victim, and they can be effective at creating change because everyone involved is in a safe space. Restorative justice approaches have been used in lots of different contexts. And then there are some logical policies that institutions are adopting that make a lot of sense. In some institutions, they're using advisor committees instead of an individual advisor, which can disrupt that sort of advisor-advisee power dynamic of a single advisor. And then also, I would note pass the harasser policies, where institutions share findings of sexual harassment with prospective employers when a faculty member is looking to leave. And that also sends a great message to complainants that their report did matter, and it works to prevent that behavior from moving on to the next institution. I would say that our metrics here are still not great, and the most recent data is not that recent, frankly. But we can measure trainings and we can measure complaints. I would say that in this context, actually increased complaints may be a sign of progress because it's showing that people are starting to believe that the institution is on their side. I really think that the key culture question here is, do the people with the least amount of power in this structure, the grad students, the most junior faculty members, believe that they will be heard if they come forward? And that's the work I think all of us need to do. Thank you. And let me introduce Alicia Modestino to present her research.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to tie together some of these threads that you heard from Mary's work, as well as what Jamie was just talking about. We actually cite Mary's work, so I was very excited to meet her today. But to start off with, this is joint work with my colleagues that are listed here, but also the most important co-author I have on this paper is the Seminar Dynamics Collective, which is a group of 100 graduate students who collected our data anonymously, and many of whom still choose to remain anonymous on this paper for fear of repercussions. So if you don't think that this is an important topic in academia, I think that their reluctance to actually own ownership in a piece of work that has been published now in a top 5 economics journal speaks louder than probably anything I can say today. So according to the 2019 AEA Climate Survey, the degree to which individuals feel that they can freely participate, bringing their ideas to a conference or a seminar, varies tremendously, particularly by gender. So over or close to half of women feel like they could not present their question, idea, or view at their school or place of work, compared to only 25% of men. Again, almost half of women feel like they can't speak at a conference or during a seminar presentation, compared to about 20% of men. And about 20% of women are not even participating or going to conferences, compared to 10% of men. So I can say, like, when I go to the National Bureau of Economic Research, there are a lot of my female colleagues who are like, I would never want to give a paper there because of the kinds of treatment that they face. So seminar and conference culture is key in addressing these gender inequalities. And I do want to say up front that we can't even study the intersectionality of this with race and gender in economics because there are so few women of color in economics that we can't even measure it. And it's not like only the rank and file know about this. Leadership's known about this for a very long time. So this is from the 2019 AEA meetings. That's Janet Yellen. She was the incoming president of the American Economic Association at these meetings. And there was literally a entire session titled, "How Can Economics Solve Its Gender Problem?" I mean, do you know any other field that has such a session at their annual conference? And she described, how she has seen this play out, where men are interrupting a women's presentation to say that's outright wrong on the first slide. And so we kind of picked up this challenge to study how women are treated differently. And so in terms of like the legal speak, right, we're looking at differential treatment as opposed to the one thing we can't address with our study, which is differential impact. And so I'm going to put that question aside for now, just to ask the very observational question of how are women treated differently when they're at the front of the room. And in case, you might still question why this is an important thing to study. The trends that we saw this morning that Laura put up are even more dismal in economics in terms of the pipeline, right? And so we've even seen over time the number of economics undergraduate majors has leveled off, and we're not even at 50%, okay? The share of women who are in graduate classes looks very much like when I was here at Harvard studying in the economics department years ago, right? So I'm not going to say how long, but very little progress has been made over the last decade, whether we are talking about undergraduate majors, first-year PhD students, new PhDs. The only reason why you're seeing associate professors and professors going up is because that's women that finally made it through the pipeline, right? But even then, right, if we're not adding to those earlier ranks, we're going to see that leveling off. Gender disparities in public discourse are not new. There's actually very famous, probably examples of this that you've all seen on CNN or other kinds of places where women are getting interrupted in congressional testimony or Supreme Court arguments. Women get asked more questions than men during academic seminars and other settings, like we heard from Mary. Women economists in particular have been noted to be treated differently than similarly situated men on virtually every margin that's been studied. So whether it's the publication process, whether or not they get cited fairly relative to their male co-authors, whether or not they are promoted equally. So that's a study by Donna Ginther and Shu Khan looking at women falling off the career ladder. This was done in like 2004. They did a study. How have we made progress? No, not really. They're still 15% less likely to be promoted. And so this is, just very acute in economics. What did we do? So we collected data in two ways. So we collected data in person in these kinds of settings, right, where speakers are at the front of the room and audience members can question them. We studied job market talks, regular seminars. We studied the National Bureau of Economic Research Summer Institute, which is like the premier economics nerd fest that happens in the summer. We also studied this online because the pandemic gave us the opportunity when all of this moved online to study it in a different dynamic. And we studied the NBR Summer Institute twice, right, to see if anything had changed over time. So things to know is like we've studied it in every setting, in person, hybrid, online, high stakes seminars like job market talks, low stake things like regular seminars, conference presentations that are more structured, other kinds of things that are less structured. So pretty much I think we've run the gamut here. How did we collect the human data? We used an online tool where our coders would sit in the audience, note all of the different attributes of the talk, and then we had an interactive online tool where they would press a button when the seminar started. They would look at who was answering the question. They would indicate the tone of the question. Was it supportive, patronizing, disruptive, demeaning, or hostile? The kind of question it was. Was it a clarifying question? Was it a suggestion? Was it a criticism? And then if the question was answered, deferred, ignored, and then there was also a back and forth button because economists just interrupt each other all the time. The machine data came from the recorded seminar, so more similar to what Mary's study was, but we analyzed this with machine learning to count the number of interruptions using speaker diarization, right, where you can tell like that the speaker has shifted by the measure of their voice. And then we predicted gender using a neural network, and then we labeled the emotional tone of the voice. So we captured the qualitative aspect of the questions in two ways. One was how humans perceive this question, the tenor of it, like that was nasty, or right, how the tone, how it was said, right? Because we can all say things very nicely that are not very nice, right? So we captured both of those things. Just looking at the data, you can see, right, that the mass in terms of the average number of questions that women are asked is shifted to the right, so they're getting asked more questions than men. You can see here the long tail in terms of the number of questions. So econ seminars are a little like engineering seminars where we're getting interrupted every 3 minutes usually. Like this is just a joy to me to come up here and just talk, right? And we did, again, I don't want to just put up Greek letters here for you, but this is just to convince you and my other fellow economists in the audience. We not only just counted the number of interruptions, but we really tried to hone in on similarly situated folks. So we controlled for the seminar that you're presenting it in. So we are only comparing men and women in the Harvard Labor Economics seminar, right, where the same audience usually shows up. We are comparing men and women and we are accounting for their seniority, their citation count, whether they're in the US, if they're a junior or a senior colleague, the kinds of topics that they work on. Why? Because reviewer 2 said, well, maybe women just work on more interesting topics. That's not the case. That's not why they're getting more questions. And we also accounted for the audience gender composition, which does change when there's a woman at the front of the room. So just to show you some results, there are many results in this paper. We slice the data every way that you can, but in general, when you pool all the samples together, we find that women are getting on average 10% more questions every time that they come to the front of the room. Remember, this is within the same exact seminar setting and accounting for all of those attributes that I talked about. And we also looked by field, because you might say, well, microeconomists actually study discrimination. Maybe they're treating people better. Not really. really. We find it in micro, in macro. I'd like to say it's a little bit worse in macro, but we really can't say that, right? We find it in every setting and in every field. So you might still say, well, you get more questions. Maybe you're getting more constructive feedback, right? Who's to say that these are bad questions? Well, women on average get more negative questions. Most of these negative questions are coming from men in the audience, but it's not all men. So men tend to ask more questions during job market talks, and they are the ones asking more of the negative questions. In regular seminars, it's both men and women who are throwing hard questions more often at the female speaker. And in conference presentations, it's actually more likely to be women throwing the hard questions. So I don't think we can just throw men under the bus here. I think it's all of us. Whenever I read this quote to a room like this, I'm not going to read it because I'm running out of time. This kind of audience will be shocked to hear that, there's a whole audience in the corner of the room talking over the speaker. But I'm looking at Melanie who's going, yeah, I've seen this before, right? This happens in economics all the time, unfortunately. So then reviewer 2 still wasn't convinced that this was a thing, right? So we said, well, let's look and see who's being talked over, which we can do with the recorded seminars. And women are more likely to be talked over than men. And in fact, all of the talking over that's happening for women is being done by men, which means that every extra question that's being asked by men, 75% of them, they're interrupting the speaker mid-sentence, okay? Clearly, as Mary said, rude, to say the least. Okay, what are the big picture implications here that we walked away from? I think there's compelling evidence that female presenters are being treated very differently than men, and not in a good way. How do we actually contextualize this based on the deeper questions that people are raising today? You might say, well, 10% extra questions, that's really not such a big deal. But when it happens every time you come up here, it adds up over a career, over a lifetime. And if they're all negative questions, right, that also is particularly demoralizing. The other thing is, like, we're only capturing what we can measure, right? So if this is how I'm getting treated at the front of the room at a job market talk where you're trying to recruit me, imagine how I get treated at a faculty meeting. Imagine how I get treated on my teaching evaluations or teaching assessments, right? Those are things we haven't even really captured. So how to change the culture of the economics profession. I agree, like, training could be helpful. I even think we need to start deeper and at home. And so Sue Donarski, who's a dear colleague who's here at the Graduate School of Education, she really honed in on the fact that economics likes to say that, the market will get rid of discrimination for us. Like, we'll just compete it away, right? If women want to be in places where they're respected, then, wow, I should be nice to them during a job market talk and be able to hire them. We are the market for those interactions. So when we see that happen in our seminar settings, we need to moderate it, right? The bystander. Some other folks are like, we really got to start at home. And so we made our tool available to departments so they can do a self-assessment, right? No, I don't need to come to your department and call you out. You can call your colleagues out, and we can just do it in a very agnostic way to say, as a group, we're not treating women very well. I don't have to point out that it's you or you or you. And then finally, I'll just say, every time I present this paper in an econ setting, I have to apologize for the past behavior of some of my co-authors who, upon doing this paper, self-reflected and realized as a younger version of themselves, they also were not training or walking the walk in treating women particularly well during seminar settings, and tend to ask questions that were just obnoxious, trying to make himself look smart, etc. There's still time for us to all reflect and do better. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to hand it now to our last speaker, Leroy Gonsalves.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm excited to be here today presenting some research on tenure extensions and faculty diversity. And this is with my amazing co-authors, Kwan-Woo Kim, Gal Dutch, Sandra Kolov, and Frank Dobbin. Okay, so as we've discussed, women remain underrepresented in academic roles. And for this paper, we're really focused on representation. What is the demographic composition of the tenured faculty? And so we know descriptively that women tend to leave at higher rates than men across all ranks, at assistant, associate, and full professor levels. Now, when focusing on junior women, we know that the specter of motherhood is an issue. Tenure denial gets a lot of the attention, but in fact, a lot of women never go up for tenure at all and choose to leave the profession or choose to leave their university before having the chance to be evaluated. And so Thebaud and Taylor describe this phenomenon, these anticipatory concerns, as the specter of motherhood, and point to the fact that the up or out promotion process that's unique to academia really comes at the worst possible time, coinciding with prime childbearing years. And so it's for this reason that the American Association of University Professors decided in 1974 to recommend tenure clock extensions as really the main tool that we have to improve gender equity. However, in the subsequent decades, the consensus has been that this initiative has been largely ineffective for a couple of reasons. So number one, people have pointed to low utilization. So there's commonly policy use hesitancy, which we see for tenure extensions, as we do with all kinds of work-life policies. So basically, people who have them available and are eligible choose not to use them because they don't want to face the career consequences of being perceived as less committed or less competent. Second, there are concerns about discrimination against policy users. And for tenure extensions, that could look like external evaluators or tenure committees just having higher expectations, demanding more productivity for that time taken off. And then finally, many people have pointed to a concern about misuse of tenure extensions by fathers. This is the idea that fathers might simply take the extension and instead of spending time raising their children and caregiving, they simply produce more papers. And so together, critics have really painted a negative picture of tenure extensions, suggesting that at best they have no effects, and at worst they might actually harm women's representation. So I'm going to share some descriptives from our study, where we have a nationally representative sample of US universities and colleges between 1993 and 2015. And so you can see that in 1993, tenure extensions were very rare. Only about a quarter of schools had them. Yet by 2015, they become really the dominant gender equity policy, with over 70% of schools adopting them. And so our research question is basically, has this worked? Have tenure extensions increased gender diversity among tenured faculty? And one thing that we find is that there's quite a bit of policy variation across universities in what those extensions look like. So the most common policy at 53% is to offer them to mothers and fathers, whereas only 17% of schools offer them to women only. The other policy feature is around how you access them. So the most common at 52% is to require people to opt into the policy by requesting special permission. By contrast, only 18% of schools have them applying automatically by default to parents. So a little bit about our data. So we have 400 universities that we observe annually between 1993 to 2015. And so we have a nationally representative sample for US universities. And we also have, from an original retrospective survey, data on what policies these schools adopted and at what point in time. So we know their history of promotion and tenure policies, and other related policies, such as diversity policies, hiring policies, and work-life policies. We also have data on faculty gender composition from the IPADS database. So this gives us faculty race, ethnicity, and gender. And typically, we often look at these data only looking at gender, but here we have the ability to actually look at race by gender groups distinctly. And so the outcome that we're focused on is the share of each race by gender group following program adoption. So did the tenured faculty become more diverse in terms of gender diversity after adopting these various types of tenure clock extensions? And we use a staggered difference in difference approach because we have multiple types of policies occurring at multiple points in time. And so here's what we find. So overall, across all the different types of tenure clock extensions, we find that contrary to expectations, we actually see generally positive effects for women in terms of representation among tenured faculty in the years following adoption. So we see positive increases in the share of white women, Black women, Hispanic women, and Asian women, although these are only significant for white women, Hispanic women, and Asian women. So overall, it does seem to have positive effects for women's representation. Now, when we look at the universal features, in the top panel, we see what happens when schools adopt by request extensions versus automatic extensions. And so the key takeaway from these plots is that we see more positive effects when the policies apply automatically and people don't have to single themselves out for special treatment. So we see larger positive effects for Black and Asian women for the automatic extensions. Now, interestingly, in the bottom panel, when we see what happens when this is a women's focused policy versus a parental policy, we actually find that including fathers still shows positive effects for women. In other words, women disproportionately benefit even when fathers are included. So we conclude that universal policy features generally have more positive effects for women compared to the other policy combinations, which still do have positive effects. Okay, so a couple conclusions. So based on prior research on work-life policies, the research really suggests that a lot of these policies are great for health, for well-being, for work-life balance, for life satisfaction, but they often are quite poor for career advancement, often derailing people's careers and putting women on slower tracks. However, our research shows that tenure clock extensions are generally much more effective than has been assumed for advancing women's representation in academic careers. And specifically, early concerns about men unfairly benefiting from these extensions may be overstated. We suggest that universal policy design, including fathers and making it automatic, might actually have the effect of mainstreaming the policy, increasing utilization and decreasing policy use hesitancy among users. And this might also have some level of cultural change in terms of reducing potential discrimination, bias, or higher productivity expectations for policy users. So the gender story in our data is pretty clear. Regardless of policy features, this seems to really help women. But the race findings are more complex and quite interesting. We generally do see more positive effects for women of color, and we see some positive effects for some minority groups of men, particularly for Black men. So I will stop there, and thank you so much for your time.